Some of my books, the two smaller pictures showing books, that was my first attempt, all full of equations and philosophical disquisitions and pieces of history, and nobody wanted to read those. So I tried this popular version called Natural Justice. And when I say natural, I don't mean the kind of things that philosophers commonly mean. You know, for example, when a philosopher says natural law, I mean, a law in that sense isn't a law, and nor is it natural. And I mean what a biologist would mean by natural justice. So this is what I'm trying to do. And I've arranged this talk in 3 parts, and if I don't manage the last part, it won't be so terrible. So let me first distinguish myself from the orthodoxy in philosophy. So I think certainly in the United States and in my own country, the United Kingdom, the metaphysics of morals is completely dominant. But there is also a long and very respectable history for trying to treat morality as a science. I don't pretend to try and treat the whole of morality. I'm just talking about fairness. And I claim Aristotle. I could have claimed, well, certainly I would claim Epicurus. I could have claimed Hobbes. But here, my big hero is David Hume. And you can hardly separate Adam Smith from David Hume. Adam Smith was David Hume's pupil. Adam Smith said to him, "Never mention me, because then you will be said to be an atheist and you'll never get a job." Nobody would give David Hume a job, an academic job, because he was said to be an atheist. And obviously he was. And here are modern books. And I'm actually going to draw on the metaphysical tradition. Very important to me is John Rawls. Very important to me is John Hassani. And both of those guys were very solidly Kantians. What I do is I borrow their clothes, I take their analysis and I reinterpret it, not to be metaphysical, but in a naturalistic sense. And here are books which are more solidly and obviously belong to the science of morals. And Brian Skyrms in particular. Peter Singer, probably everybody knows Peter Singer because he's so controversial. This is his early book, Expanding Circles. He's now moved to a place where I really don't care to go. So this is the young Peter Singer. And I admire John Mackay very much. This is his book, Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. But, you know, even Robert Nozick turned in our direction. Philip Kitcher and Robert Sugden in economics deserves very much to be remembered. Okay, so let's try and see where we're going. Expanding circles is a term borrowed from Peter Singer, and you know, he follows Aristotle, and Aristotle says somewhere or other that morality begins within the family, and so Peter Singer says, well, let's first look at, well, he would say more than food sharing, but I say let's look at food sharing within the family. And food sharing within the family is very common in biology. I was just talking to a biologist this morning about African hunting dogs who share food in a very egalitarian way, we'd say, if they were human. And then somehow or other, people like me, naturalists, think that there's this biological phenomenon somehow expanded so that we learn to share, not just within the family, but within the clan. Here we're talking about hunter-gatherers, ancestral hunter-gatherers in groups of 100 would be a lot, 150 would be exceptional. I gather you listened to Robin Dunbar on this subject not so very long ago. So I'm with Robin on this. And then what one hopes is that if we can understand how sharing works within the clan, within small groups, we can learn to use it on a larger scale, coordinating within a nation state. And I'm not very optimistic about coordinating within the species. Immanuel Kant thought he was talking about coordinating between any rational entities. would coordinate in the same way. I think it's just nonsense. And however, John Rawls, he was a Kantian, and he thought that what he was doing was operationalizing the categorical imperative through his idea of the original position, which I should say right now in case I forget, independently invented by John Hassani at about the same time in the early 1950s. And he argued that his original position shows that a fairer society, and there he's talking about a nation state, would be simultaneously fair and egalitarian. And I guess most people in this room share his aspirations. We would all like, well, perhaps not everybody, but pretty much everybody in Denmark probably thinks that it would be great if our societies could be both fair and egalitarian. And in his later work, Rawls ceases to talk about any nation states, and he just talks about the United States of America. But he's got farther to go. We have here in Europe, most of us within Europe. So that's the one position. But this is a top-down way of thinking, and that's completely the opposite for the way I'm trying to proceed, people like me. So we want to begin at the bottom and work up. And we have a good basis at the bottom. We understand to a considerable extent how animals can be, their genes can program animals to share food within the family. And this is due to this brilliant biologist called Bill Hamilton. And his theory is nowadays called kin selection. And but nowadays kin selection means something more general, but here I just mean sharing food within the family. I use this English kin in its literal sense. To be kin is to belong to the same family. But this is where I'm focused, on sharing within the clan. I'm particularly interested in how did fairness get started, fairness as we understand it. And I think it got started at this level, within the clan. And it got started when we were pre-human, at the time when we were ceasing to be proto-human, perhaps would be a better term, and beginning to become modern humans. And somehow we learned how to share, not just within the family, but with strangers, or at least unrelated people. And this is kind of my the statement of my position. This is a vampire bat, and the biologist Wilkinson claims that unrelated vampire bats, this is quite important, the unrelated, because as I said earlier, it's very common for animals who are related to share food. Vampire bats, they really exist. They go out and suck blood from animals. And when they come back to the caves in which they live during the day, or they sleep during the day, some bats are full of blood and some are empty. And the empty bats beg for blood, and sometimes they're given blood. The full bat will, it's not very nice, but the full bat will disgorge blood, and then the hungry bat will lap it up. And according to Wilkinson, they share blood on a reciprocal basis. You know, in humans, we would say, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. And these bats say, or would say, I'll give you blood if you will give me blood on a future occasion. So they have their way of sharing, and we call our way of sharing, the way that evolved in our species, we call it fairness. And my view is, contrary to most moral philosophers, my view is, if some other way of sharing had evolved in our species, if we had a different biology, almost certainly that would have happened, then metaphysical moral philosophers would say, written in some Platonic realm, is this other way of sharing. And I'm sure my philosophical commentator will explain why this is completely wrong. But I can see him working up over there. So how do I study this? And there's kind of two avenues. And one is borrowed from kin selection. So here I borrow Hassani's notion of the intercomparison of utility of different human beings. I draw attention to how this is very similar to Bill Hamilton's kin selection theory. And this provides me with a way of making welfare comparisons, which are really important. But unfortunately, I haven't got time to talk about that. I mean, this is my real contribution. The rest of what I do is kind of putting together other people's work in a new way. And what I'm going to concentrate on here is the deep structure of fairness norms. I believe the deep structure of fairness norms is universal in the human species. It's also kind of built into our genes. And people tell me, don't say that. It's more persuasive if you don't say it. And I know it's more persuasive if you don't say it. You claim less, but intellectually dishonest not to claim what you think to be the case. And so I think this is Rawls' original position. I think he had wonderful intuition, and Hassani too, for that matter. And but they were wrong. They're trying to place the original position up here in this, in the world of Plato. It begins down here at the bottom. It's an evolutionary construct. Now, I guess some people here are thinking, what is the original position? I've met young philosophers not so distant past who never heard of John Rawls, which I think is quite astonishing. One of the great philosophers of all time. And, here's his book. Many editions of this book. I like the one with the ripples, because it reminds me of expanding circles. I don't know if you use this icon of justice in Denmark. We have this statue on top of the Old Bailey in London. The Old Bailey is a big criminal court, which you can read about in Charles Dickens. And you notice that she's got three aspects. I'll start with the sword. The sword is for enforcement. This is what makes justice work. Thomas Hobbes said, covenants without the sword are but words. And in biology, this is obviously the case. And so how am I going to deal with enforcement? I need game theory for this purpose. And what about the comparison of welfare? This corresponds to, is this working? This corresponds to her scales. She needs the scales to compare welfare. For example, in a health application, you might need to ask, how should we compare how long an old lady should wait for her hip replacement with the question of whether a drunken cigarette smoker should get a heart replacement? That's a welfare comparison. And this is what I need Hassani's theory for. But what we're concentrating on now, or about to, is her veil, which corresponds to John Rawls' veil of ignorance. And so let me explain that. So to explain this, I've got Adam and Eve. And we're imagining Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Okay. I don't know if you can see, they've got fig leaves in appropriate places. So this isn't an improper picture at all. And the question is, what would be a fair contract? Social contract or marriage contract for Adam and Eve. And here I don't mean contract in the legal sense, because there is no legal system in the Garden of Eden. It's just, how should we arrange our lives? And what Hassani said, what Rawls said, using Rawls' terminology here, is what Adam and Eve should do is they should go into the original position behind a veil of ignorance. And what the veil of ignorance conceals from them is their identity. So behind the veil of ignorance, they are not allowed to take account of the fact that Adam is a man and Eve is a woman. Nor are they allowed to know who they will be when they come out from behind the veil of ignorance, because there's all an act of imagination. And in that situation, they bargain about what marriage contract to operate. And the idea is that it will be a fair deal because neither party will wish to create a disadvantaged party because they themselves might end up as the disadvantaged party. Right? And usually when this story is told, probably better than I'm telling it now, people are immediately struck by what a good idea it is, because it's a version of the do as you would be done by principle that meets the objection, do not do to others as you would have them do unto you, because they may not have the same tastes as yours. I sometimes tell the story about when my wife liked to go out running in the early morning, and I would explain to her, please do not shake me awake to join you in this activity, because my tastes are not the same as yours. I'm more inclined to have to lie in bed for another hour or two and bring me a cup of coffee when you come home. So here I've got, because I'm using game theory as my way of getting rationality into the model everywhere I can. When Adam goes behind the veil of ignorance, his name is John. John for John von Neumann. And when Eve goes behind the veil of ignorance, her name is Oscar, for Oscar Morgenstern. And here you can see John explaining his state of knowledge while they bargain about what deal to operate when they come out from behind the veil of ignorance. So John is saying, well, look, I might be Adam and Oscar might be Eve, but the alternative is that Oscar might be Adam and I might be Eve. And Hassani is very explicit that we should attribute a probability of a half to each of these possibilities. And Rawls is more slippery on this subject. Okay, that was the introduction. And for those who know all about Rawls and the original position, I apologize for telling you what you knew already. Okay, so let me talk about John Mackay. I think John Mackay was very brave to say these kinds of things when it was a total no-no in philosophy. And this book is still worth reading. About the first third of the book is a condemnation of metaphysical moral philosophy. He takes the arguments one by one, and then he analyzes them, and he points out they fall to pieces when very closely analyzed. And I'm completely sold. And orthodox philosophers won't forgive me for this, but they did forgive John Mackay, I suppose, because he had a proper philosophical scholar. The other half of the book, the positive half, the positive 2/3, is not so successful. But what he says at the beginning is, if we want to do scientific philosophy, where should be our data? And he says the answer is anthropology. And then he says, and how should we structure our thinking? And his answer is game theory. And I completely sold on the game theory. And it took me a long time to be convinced of the anthropology, but I am convinced. So I'm going to do anthropology in 2 minutes. A social contract, remember, this is just the way a society organizes itself. Of pure hunter-gatherer societies. Now, pure is very important here. So I mean societies which make their living only by hunting and gathering and not by any other means at all. None of these societies are left now, but at the beginning of the century there were still such societies. There were still such societies in the jungles of India in 1947. There was the Aceh Indians survived as hunter-gatherers in Paraguay, the jungles of Paraguay, until 70s and 80s, pretty much untouched. And what we hope is that the properties of these societies that anthropologists observed were also true of our ancestral societies. So I'm going to take this for granted. Perhaps it's wrong because social contracts don't leave any fossils. And they have two remarkable properties which are universal in these societies. This is equally remarkable, as I'll say in a moment. First, they have no bosses. Nobody in these societies feels entitled to tell anybody else what to do. And, but of course, they're just the same as us genetically, so they have the same urge to dominate. So how is it suppressed? Why don't the guys with the big muscles take charge and tell everybody else what to do? And the answer is, if they try, everybody else gangs up on them. It doesn't matter how big you are. If you've got 20 other people saying, no, we're not having it, there's nothing you can do. And they're very careful not to give the impression. And those who do give the impression of trying to boss other people around, there are kind of 3 steps to the mechanism that keeps them in order. And it's very like academic life, actually. The first step is people laugh. Who do you think you are? How ridiculous your behavior is. And if you ever tried to give a new idea to I once tried to give in the 1980s, I tried to give a lecture on how economic finance, the way economic finance was done, was mistaken. And that Bayesian decision theory was not the right model. And I was laughed off the stage. I thought it was hilarious. And then throughout the rest of the conference, every time someone used Bayes' rule, they would say, and there's someone at this conference who doesn't believe in Bayes' rule. And they're like, oh. And so I know what it's like to be laughed at. It's not nice. The next step is, if the bossy person persists, then people stop talking to that person. Turn their backs, deliberately turn their backs. And academic life, they won't publish your papers. And the third step is if it's persistent, the person is expelled from the group, which in ancestral times would probably mean you're dead. And in academic life, you don't get your tenure. And it's not just academic life, of course. We still retain. Now, fair division is even more remarkable. So, the way food is shared, particularly meat, is almost incredibly egalitarian. And it doesn't matter, whether you were part of the group that went to do the hunting. You might be an orphan. Orphans don't get as much as people whose parents, but they still get fed. And so if you don't believe these things, I found these things very hard to believe. Have a look in my book. It's a wonderful gift for elderly relatives anyway. And look in the references, the anthropological references. So here are some examples. And this is a Greenland Eskimo. We're not really supposed to say Eskimo anymore. This is an Australian Aborigine. This is a Kalahari Bushman. And these are Aceh Indians from Paraguay. And what's striking about these groups, I chose them because they come from such very different parts of the world. I could have done Andaman Islanders, and their social contracts are all the same, in the sense of having no bosses and fair division. And I think it's because the urge to behave in this kind of way is captured in our genes. The deep structure of this behavior is captured in our genes. And I read sociology books which argue, not from anthropology, but they argue that part of the reason for the malaise that modern people often feel is that our genes tell us to do one thing and our culture tells us to do another. So apart from the universality of these social contracts, I've got no more grounds for claiming genetic origin for the deep structure. So it's no use asking me to defend that better because I can't. Now, that was anthropology. Okay, now I'm going to do game theory in a slightly longer time. So again, I apologize to people who know game theory. So I'm going to do this by showing 2 simple games. Probably everybody knows the prisoner's dilemma. And the stag hunt game, David Lewis, the philosopher David Lewis, proposed this game as a way of modeling a story in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Inequality of Man. Probably philosophers here will know the story, and for other people it would take too long to tell. And here, Adam is just going to be Adam and Eve are playing the game. in what I call the game of life, the relevant game that people are actually playing. Usually there'll be lots of players and there'll be many strategies, and the choices of strategy won't be made simultaneously. I'll just make it as simple as possible. So here Adam has got two strategies. He chooses a row, and Eve, she chooses a column. And in this situation, they choose simultaneously. And here are Adam's payoffs. And in orthodox game theory, these would be utilities from Neumann Morgenstern utilities, not money, it would be utilities. And I've included this slide because I've just been, a German journalist called Schirmacher has just denounced me in a book. I am the arch villain. I am the prophet of selfishness. It's because of me and people like me that the credit crunch took place, and so on and so on. And it's a lot of fun. But he doesn't understand, not at all, that utilities, because somebody maximizes their own utility, it doesn't make them selfish. If Adam was Sir Francis of Assisi, he would have utility for helping other people. And we, economists, we don't care what people have utility for. I mean, we have this dictum in Latin, de gustibus non disputandum. It's not for us to tell people what they want. It's for them to tell us what they want. And psychologists can study that issue if they want, anthropologists, but we economists, you tell us what you want and we try and get it for you. And if what you want is to help other people, if you think money should be spent binding up the legs of pigeons who hurt themselves, well, that's fine. That's not our concern. Here are Eve's payoffs, and if you put them all together, there are two games. How do we analyze these games? And the first thing to do is to ask what are best replies. So let's take this this 3 up here. Why have I put a circle around that 3? Well, suppose Eve is just trying to decide, shall I play dove or shall I play hawk? And she thinks, well, if I knew that Adam was going to play dove, I could get 2 or I could get 3. 3 is bigger than 2, so I put a circle around the 3. So the circle means that hawk is the best reply to dove. And this circle means that hawk is the best reply to hawk. I'll do the same for Adam. Here I've done it again for the stag hunt game. And focus on the cells in these payoff tables where both the payoffs are circled. And these are Nash Equilibrium. This is all a Nash Equilibrium is, if you haven't met this idea before. So you've probably heard of John Nash because he's the person represented in the movie A Beautiful Mind. In fact, I had dinner with John Nash and his wife and various other people after they came back from seeing the rushes of the movie. And we asked them, how good was the movie? And actually, when I eventually saw the movie myself, they completely failed to understand the idea of a Nash equilibrium. But neither Nash nor his wife Alicia give a damn, because Nash was just, Russell Crowe is so handsome. And Alicia, I forgot the name of the woman who played Alicia, but she was a real beauty. In fact, when you see pictures of Nash and Alicia when they were very good looking, and also. Now, I was talking about rationality assumptions and so forth, but what matters in this context isn't rationality. What matters is evolution. And I think whenever Nash equilibria actually work in economic applications, it's because of the evolutionary interpretation. If you think about it a little bit, you don't need to do any equations. If you're thinking about it a little, suppose you've got a process, an adjustment process, that always moves in the direction of higher payoffs. It's more complicated if it's noisy, but suppose a deterministic process always moves in the direction of higher payoffs. When can it stop? Well, the only place it can stop is at a Nash equilibrium, because somebody could get a higher payoff by doing something else. They wouldn't be making a best reply. So the only time it can stop is if you're at a best reply. And what Bill Hamilton, separately from his kin selection, added to this is if you interpret these numbers, these payoffs, as fitnesses, biological fitnesses, which is essentially the expected number of children that you get as a result of your behavior, it becomes almost a tautology that you will observe an equilibrium. So Nash equilibrium is going to be our basic idea. Nash equilibrium is what we're going to care about. Let me go back to this picture. So if this silly, let's say this silly little stag hunt game, suppose that was a representation of our game of life. The thing to notice is it's got two equilibria in pure strategies. There's a bad one where everyone gets 2, and there's a better one where everyone gets 4. I suppose our society was stuck at this bad one. This is the point Rousseau was trying to make. If we were stuck at this bad equilibrium, how would we get ourselves out of this bad equilibrium into this good equilibrium? And we can't contemplate anything that's not an equilibrium, because anything that's not an equilibrium will not be stable. We might try and make it work, and it might work for a little while, but the structure of it is wrong. Eventually, people will deviate because it's out of equilibrium. So the only viable social contracts in this theory I'm presenting are Nash equilibrium. And many game theorists will argue that Nash equilibrium isn't enough, but I'm not going to push that point. However, there's a problem that you don't see in the stag hunt game. This is the driving game. When we get up in the morning, we can either drive on the left or the right. And there are two basic equilibria. We can all drive on the left, or we can all drive on the right. So if you like, in the driving world, there are two social contracts, stable social contracts. There's also a third one where we choose where to drive at random. So it's a mixed equilibrium. And I remember saying nobody in the world uses this mixed equilibrium. And there were some Turks in the audience, and they said, "You've never been to Turkey." I have been to Turkey now, and I see what they mean. It's not so much they drive at random, they try to drive wherever it's convenient. And as long as we were at that bad equilibrium where everyone drives at random, and then the question would be, well, how do we improve things? And there are two ways of improving. One is we'll all move to driving on the left, like we do in my own country, or we could all drive on the right, like you do here in Denmark. And nobody would care which. Nobody cares which, because you get the same payoff. Everybody gets 1 at the left equilibrium, and everyone gets 1 at the right equilibrium. But what about the battle of the sexes? This dates from before the triumph of feminism. So it's very similar setup, but now Adam likes the box equilibrium, and Eve likes the ball equilibrium. So how is that problem to be resolved? And there's no rational arguments that are going to help you, because any argument in favor of the box equilibrium is equally an argument in favor of the ball equilibrium. And so you have to inject something else, just like you can't distinguish between all drive on the left or all drive on the right by rationality. There's nothing for it to work on. So similarly in the battle of the sexes. Now I think if our game of life, when our species was getting started, had been the battle of the sexes, we would not have solved the problem. How come? Oh, I should have shown you this first. So social norms evolved to solve the equilibrium selection problem. This is what Michael wants to hear. Okay. And I'm completely, this is what social norms are for in this way of thinking. Drive on the left is a social norm. It coordinates our behavior on a particular equilibrium, and we have to restrict ourselves to equilibria, because otherwise the coordination would fail in the long run. And I'm not the first person to say this by any means, and here's a variety of persons. David Hume is the first person I know. Tom Schelling won the Nobel Prize for saying this kind of thing. I don't think he'd read David Hume. There's no reference to David Hume. David Lewis from philosophy, he'd read Schelling and he knew Hume, put the two together. Bob Trivers is a very famous biologist who says similar things. And, you know, Peyton Young has done some wonderful mathematics discussing evolutionary processes that would lead to one social norm rather than another. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, you know, these are the essential, these other books are essential. Now, I was just saying that if the battle of the sexes had represented our game of life, the evolution would have found the equilibrium selection problem too hard. But it isn't. In our game of life, we don't play you know, hunter-gatherer group wouldn't have played their game of life just once and that's it. They would have played it today, and they would play it tomorrow, and they play it the next day and the next day. And, so they play a repeated game. And here I'm trying to represent the game of life with the indefinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma. It doesn't really matter which game you repeat, the essence will be the same. This term, reciprocal altruism, was proposed by Robert Trivers, who I mentioned on the previous slide. Now, what's different about repeated games is they have very large numbers of equilibria. So you're not restricted to just one or two choices. You actually have an infinite number of choices. And here I'm showing this strategy here is called the Grinnin Strategy. You're going to play the repeated game. How are you going to play it? Well, you start. Come on, come on. Oh, this is not the time to fail me. Okay, I have to try and point. You got, yeah. Thanks. What do I press? The top one? Great, it works. We start by playing dove. If the other guy plays dove, you continue by playing dove. If the other guy always plays dove, you will play dove all the time. And you'll get the outcome that everybody agrees that this is the cooperative outcome. And, but if the other guy ever cheats, in quotes, on the strategy the other guy's supposed to play, you switch to playing hawk and you stay there forever. This is why it's called the Grinnin Strategy. Because this is the punishment waiting for a cheater, and it's called grim because you never forgive, punish forever. Now, if both players play the Grim Strategy, it's a Nash Equilibrium of the indefinitely repeated game, provided players are sufficiently patient, provided they care enough about the future. And it's easy to see why. If the other guy is playing this strategy, you'd be really stupid ever to play hawk. You get a little payoff from playing hawk at that moment, but after that, it's hawk forever. And stupid. So nothing clever about this, nothing clever at all. So it's been rediscovered over and over and over. It was discovered first by David Hume in 1739. It was discovered by a bunch of game theorists in 1950. It was discovered by Robert Trivers in 1976. He had better publicity because reciprocal altruism is such a good term. It was rediscovered by Robert Axelrod in 1984. And people still write to me. I had one from China this morning saying, you game theorists don't understand anything. But it's a really good idea and worth rediscovering all the time. Don't let me go with this. I got an example of this in real life. I used to do diamonds for the Antwerp diamond market, but I'd better skip that. The quote is from the New York Times of 1990 something, and it's about a scout, they're called. They supply the New York antique shops. So they go out to the Midwest and they look for rocking chairs and spinning wheels and stuff like that, which New Yorkers want very much. So they bring them back to New York And then they're sold on commission in these fancy antique stores. And the journalist asked this guy, well, you know, you're supposed to be getting, say, 10% commission. And so you come back and you find the rocking chairs sold. And so you say to the antique store owner, how much did you get? And he says, $10,000. So you should get $1,000 for this. Right? And the journalist said, well, why do you believe him? You know, perhaps he sold it for $20,000. And this is the reply. Sure, I trust him. You know the ones to trust in this business, the ones who betray you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye is, in American, is baby talk for goodbye. I won't see you again. It's the Grinnin Strategy. Notice. Everybody knows the Grinnin Strategy. They only think they don't know the Grinnin Strategy because it's all dressed up in mathematics. And it's good that it's dressed up in mathematics because it means it makes sense. But just because it's in mathematics doesn't mean you don't understand it already. All right, this is the folk theorem of repeated game theory. What we've got on the x-axis is Adam's payoff. This is average payoff in a repeated game, indefinitely repeated game with patient players. And this is Eve's average payoff. And all of the pairs of points in this yellow region, these are all of the payoff pairs which are possible by playing the game. All the possible ways of playing the game. And I've got a simplified form of the folk theorem here. It says, suppose this is an equilibrium. This pair of payoffs is supported, you know, by strategies that make it an equilibrium. And suppose this is where we are now. This is the status quo of our society. This is our social contract. What the folk theorem says, I think the proof is almost trivial. This is why lots of game theorists discovered it more or less simultaneously after Nash published his paper on Nash Equilibrium. Anything that gives each player at least as much as the status quo equilibrium, that pair of points, pair of payoffs, is also supportable as equilibrium. So we can have any of these points. Any of these points are available to us as equilibrium. But there's lots of them. And the question is, which one? Which one? There's a prior question. Group selection is an interesting topic. Right? If anyone wants to hear about why evolution should be expected to pick one of these efficient equilibria rather than just an equilibrium, put your hand up. That's great. Here's the explanation. You can ask me again afterwards. Okay. And now, you know, given that one of these equilibria is to be selected, which one? There's no use saying, you know, evolution is going to select, is going to make the outcome efficient. There's no point. If some people think the right equilibrium is this, and some people think the right, everyone's got to coordinate on the same equilibrium. So in order to solve this problem, evolution has to have offer an equilibrium selection device. It's got to tell us which equilibrium we should coordinate on. This is, I think, the origin of fairness. So I think evolution invented for us a device for selecting an equilibrium in situations like this. Basically, this is a particular type of coordination game. And evolution found us a way of solving this problem. And the equilibrium actually selected, we call that fair. And if evolution has solved this problem in some other way, we would call that fair. It always amuses me when you watch Star Trek. The good aliens always have the same ideas on fairness as we do. And the bad aliens always have different ones. And if ever we do find aliens, rational aliens, and their biology is different from ours, they will have solved this problem differently. Okay? And they'll all be bad from the Star Trek point of view. Let's hope we don't think in this naive way if we ever do encounter aliens. Again, I better skip this. I was going to show you an experiment which illustrates this point about, I will explain it. Okay. So I did this experiment years ago with my colleague Joe Svietspinski. If you want to read about the experiment, I have a book. I got lots of books. I don't know what possesses me. It's a collection of my experimental papers. And so John Nash, apart from inventing Nash Equilibrium, he basically invented bargaining theory. And his simple model of a bargaining game is Adam can get, here it's just dollars, Adam can get anything between $0 and $10. Eve can get anything between $0 and $5. They simultaneously make a proposal. And the basic game is, if the pair of proposals, suppose he asks for $5 and he asks for $2, then that would be, this result is in the blue region, so they get it. And if Adam asked for $9 and Eve asked for $4, it would be out of the blue region and they'd both get nothing. And in Nash's story, he doesn't have a sharp boundary like this, because otherwise all this stuff, everything along here would be a Nash equilibrium, and other stuff as well, mixed equilibrium. What he does is to fuzz the boundary, and so if the joint offers are in this region, you'll have probability of 1 of getting them. If they're in this region, probability 0, but in between, the probability starts at 1 and goes down to 0. So he smooths the game like this. And the consequences of having done that is that the only Nash equilibrium is this is the Nash bargaining solution of that game. All right. Now, we in our experiment, we only did it like that because otherwise what people would say, you're not true to Nash. It was very good that we did. But because we're doing it on a computer, it's not continuous anymore, and so all this stuff on the boundary here, inside this red box, the Nash equilibrium are in here. And we didn't think people would play Nash equilibrium, so we tried to condition them. So we told them, in your practice rounds, you're going to be playing against one of these robots. Each robot is represented by a yellow square, and you're not going to know in advance which robot. But if it's this robot, that's what it will demand if it's player 1, and this is what it will demand if it's player 2. And you are sometimes player 1 and sometimes player 2. And then we had the robots converge. So this is the Rawlsian outcome, this is the utilitarian outcome, this is the Nash bargaining solution, this is the Kalai-Sporodinsky bargaining solution. Then we had the robots converge over time on one of these focal points. This is what Schelling calls a convention, or a social contract is what I'm saying. And it turned out to be very easy to condition people. After about 10 trials, we had them play each other, and they would start where we conditioned them. And then when they started playing with each other, their behavior changed over time. And what they actually did was, if they were conditioned on here, they gradually moved into this box. If they were started the utilitarian, they moved into the box. After 10 or 15 trials, every group was in this box. Every group ended up at a Nash equilibrium. But different groups ended up at different equilibria. Okay. And so I see this as mimicking the process of evolution. So all of them ended at an equilibrium, but different groups ended on different equilibria because of the accidents of their history. And then we asked them, after they played, we asked them, oh, where's it gone? Ah, yeah. We asked them, what do you regard as fair in the game that you just played? And this is the median claim of player 1, and this is the median amount said to be fair for player 1. And you notice what actually happened is really quite a good predictor. The median of what actually happened was actually quite a predictor of the median amount said to be fair. I think this kind of captures what I think happened in general. The experiment wasn't intended for this at all. In fact, this work predates my own work on fairness. Okay, so anyway, to summarize, fairness is evolution's solution to the equilibrium selection problem. And just as driving on the, I can never know which one of these to do. Driving on the right is the French solution to the driving problem, and driving on the left is the Japanese solution to the driving problem. And people say to me, so you think morality is no different from traffic signals? And well, it is in a way, you know, in a very little way. But it's kind of just kind of a way of trying to discredit this way of thinking. So how does it work? I mean, how did evolution solve the equilibrium selection problem? And I think that fairness is rather like language. Or perhaps there was a time when everybody would have known that Chomsky had discovered that all languages have a universal deep structure. And it's argued that, you know, if such a deep structure wasn't available to babies, learning a language just from hearing sounds would be impossible. But because, you know, babies have this built-in structure, they're able to make sense of what they hear. But, you know, a baby born in France will learn to speak French, and that's culturally determined. And a baby born in Japan will learn to speak Japanese. And I think fairness is the same. That there's a universal deep structure, which I think is embodied in Rawls' original position. And but the welfare comparisons that you need to operate the original position are culturally determined and often contextually determined within a given culture. So there's two things. This is, I think, the comparison with language is very apt. Whoops, this one. And why? Why? It's all very well to assert this, but why? And economists will follow this more easily than anybody else. If you think about, if you think that evolution is going to generate what rationality would produce normally, which is, economists usually take this line, and what is the rational problem faced by two vampire bats? Basically, they need to insure each other against hunger. You know, if they both go out hunting and one of them is lucky, well, if they both go out hunting and both of them are lucky, well, there's no problem. If they're both unlucky, there's nothing to share. So the only case of any interest is when one is lucky and the other is unlucky. But before this event occurs, they think, well, there's half a chance that I'll be the lucky one and the other guy will be unlucky. And there's half a chance that I'll be the unlucky one and the other guy will be the lucky one. You notice that is the structure of the original position. And so I think that got wired into our brains before we were human, just as it's presumably wired into the brains of vampire bats. And given that wiring was present, only a short step to the original position. In my books, I go on and on about this, but you're getting the half-minute version. So what bargain would you expect Oscar and John to reach in the original position? And Hassani and Rawls considered this separately, and they reached diametrically opposed conclusions. So Rawls says, you know, the result will be egalitarian, and his representation, he has this famous difference principle that game theorists call the Maximin criterion, that you consider the welfare of the worst off. You take that to be your criterion. Maximize the welfare of the worst off. And Hassani deduces utilitarianism. And who is right? They can't both be right. This is my analysis. In my book, I argue that it all depends on enforcement. So if the if there's external enforcement, so in particular, if you were considering this in the presence of a benign government that could enforce any deal reached in the original position, then the result would be utilitarian, just like Hassani says. So if you were using these principles to design a tax system, you would want the tax system to be utilitarian. But there wasn't any benign government, there wasn't any external enforcement when we were hunter-gatherers. Anything that worked would have to be self-policing. Or in game theory terms, everything would have to be in equilibrium. And in which case, I'm led to egalitarianism, not so distant from the kind of egalitarianism proposed by Rawls. So this is why I call myself a Rawlsian. In my defense, when I was despairing of making this all work out, I wrote to Rawls, who I'd met a number of times earlier, saying I was in despair, I was going to give up. And he wrote me beautiful letters, copperplate handwriting, nobody can do it anymore. Saying, don't give up. I know you're not a Kantian. So I'm very pleased to be called a Rawlsian, except his modern day followers won't accept it, which no. Now, Hassani doesn't talk about external enforcement, he talks about internal enforcement. He says there's something in us called moral commitment that will substitute for external enforcement. I think that's just a cheat. Right? And Rawls, unfortunately, does the same thing. Rawls invents something called natural duty, which serves the same role. So, if I'm right about the analysis, Rawls should have been a utilitarian, although he wrote the theory of justice in order to denounce utilitarianism. But the last third of Rawls' book is about the strains of commitment, and he explains how hard it is to commit to anything, on which he's very, very good indeed. And you could argue that I'm taking his views on the strains of commitment to the extreme. No commitment anywhere, everything in equilibrium. In which case, I'm providing an alternative defense of egalitarianism. So this is where I'm led. I think we are naturally egalitarian. And I think this is why we don't like being told what to do. There's almost nothing worse. I suppose being physically tortured would be worse, but being told what to do by a stupid boss is very, very hard to bear. What kind of egalitarian? And here my answer is, in cooperative game theory, there's this notion called the egalitarian or proportional bargaining solution. And I know of at least 5 independently produced axiom systems in which you take full account of interpersonal comparison. They all lead to this same conclusion. And I don't use any of that axiomatic stuff. And here in this picture, I'm comparing the utilitarian outcome with the egalitarian outcome. You notice the utilitarian outcome doesn't depend on the status quo, but the egalitarian outcome does. So if you want to know what's fair in this situation, you start here, you draw this line, and there it is. Okay? And your natural response is, well, where does the slope of this line come from? Because it matters enormously. This is where welfare comparisons matter. It's the welfare comparisons that determine that slope. And I call the numbers that you're going to attach to different people to tell how to weight their situation, I call them social indices. And I'm just following the psychological literature. These social indices reflect such factors as need, merit, effort, or social status. Psychologists would include investment under effort here. And the important thing for me is they're determined by cultural factors. They're not biologically determined. We do not come with our genes telling us how to evaluate this person as compared with that person. In fact, in different contexts, even in the same society, we use different criteria. For example, when Nobel Prizes are awarded, we all think that should be fair. You should be fair in awarding the Nobel Prizes, but you wouldn't consider, who needs the money more. I mean, in principle, it's certainly not true of the economics prize, but in principle, it should be who deserves it most, who is most meritorious. But on the other hand, it's a story I was telling this morning. If the soldiers are coming in from the battlefield, and Americans call it triage, when somebody goes to ask, who needs the medical treatment most? This guy's hopeless, he's dead already. This guy's about to die, there's nothing we can do. This guy's really desperate. He needs attention now. Nobody thinks we should take into account who's rich and who's poor. All that should count is who's most needy. So what counts as fair, what we use in making these welfare comparisons depends on the context. And it makes a big difference. So I changed the slopes. I changed the what counts as fair. And here I'm showing an example where the utilitarian outcome and the egalitarian outcome coincide. I haven't got time for. I was going to show you this. I was going to show you some of the theory, but there's no time for that. Okay. You can ask me afterwards. It's not a problem. And I want to draw attention to the psychology because there's more psychologists here than there are mathematicians. And when I was writing my original book, by the time I wrote Natural Justice, I knew this theory, but I didn't know at the time. There was a whole literature of which I was unaware. I talked to psychologists. I said, has anyone written on this? Oh, I've never heard of it. And it turned out all the time there was this work. And they call it modern equity theory because Aristotle said what is fair is what is proportional. And you notice that's what's being argued here. This is the conclusion that this theory brings me to. Aristotle had this intuition long, long ago. But the question was, what is proportional to what? So what I'm saying here, and what psychologists said earlier, is welfare gains over the status quo are proportional to a contextually determined, well, psychologists usually say worthiness coefficient, but I prefer the more neutral social index. Now, this is an awful book. This Graham Wagstaff is a British psychologist, and he tried to write a book that's just not just psychology, but is philosophy too. And psychology is pretty good, but the philosophy is awful. It's hard to separate the two. Of course, he doesn't think his philosophy is awful, but then nor did Immanuel Kant. And this is basically what they do. They wouldn't recognize the description either. This is how I see that. There's a status quo, and then you ask people, what do you think would be fair if anything under this curve was available? And they, on average, they might say this. What would you think is fair if you asked people, you could have anything in here, what's the fairer thing? And they tell you this, and so on. And then it turns out empirically that these points tend to lie along a line, straight line. So the guys, psychologists who came up with this had no theory at all. No theory, it was just empirical discovery. And they're very, very strong on, insistent on the idea that the way I say it is the slope of this line depends on the context. They insist on it, and quite rightly, I think. Have I got time for the summary? So fairness is evolution's solution to the equilibrium selection problem, and not a substitute for power. Okay, this is one of the no-nos for the metaphysical philosophers. For them, justice and power are just, if people are exercising power, where is the justice? And I think, no, you can never forget power. It's the power that determines what's in equilibrium, and justice evolved to select amongst equilibria. Of we try to pretend that power doesn't exist, we just waste our time. This is my point about language. Fairness norms similarly have a common deep structure, but the standard of interpersonal comparison, welfare comparison, is culturally determined, culturally and contextually determined. This is another big no-no, moral relativism. You know, the previous Pope was very hostile to moral relativism. He used to make speeches about the evilness of people like me, moral relativists. I'm only partly a moral relativist because I argue that the deep structure is universal. But the standard of welfare comparison varies. If you don't believe, there are these books. There's another book by Page and Young, but I think this is the book that probably is more influential by the political scientist Jon Elster. He kind of documents how justice varies in different places. I differ from most of these people, though, in that they would argue that the structure of fairness varies. I think the deep structure is fixed, and what's varying is the welfare comparison. I love this quote from Xenophanes. He's a pre-Socratic philosopher. If you remember, Spartacus was a Thracian, famously red-haired and blue eyes. Presumably this was true of all Thracians. And it's right, you go and look at the gods, and people with big noses have gods with big noses, and people with big feet have gods with big feet. And the same with fairness. And I chose these particular parameters because that's what psychologists do. And my theory, I got enough of mathematics to be able to do static, comparative statics, as economists say. It's actually quite hard to define these things. Thinking of a definition of need is really quite difficult. If you look in the dictionary, there are lots of different meanings of need, and you have to choose one of these meanings. Ability is pretty easy, effort is pretty easy, status isn't so easy either. And in my theory, the way the welfare comparisons vary in different contexts always depends on these considerations in the same way, but the amount by which it varies differs in different situations. And if there's anyone looking for experiments to do, it's a really good place to do experiments. Take up the work of the psychologists who called themselves modern equity theorists. That work needs to be done again by modern standards. And now we've got computers and videos. We can do all kinds of things that were impossible for those people. Nearly finished. And reform. Sometimes people say to me, who cares about all of this? You scientists might care, but I've got bigger ambitions. I used to think I might influence events at one time, but I've given up on that now. But there are young people here, and here we are. If we want to change things, people criticize, this guy Schirmacher criticizes people like me, selfish, worthless creatures. But we economists, we think we're practical people. We want to confine our attention to things that might work. And you utopians, you can construct these, and if you put them in place, they would just collapse. Right? So no such thing as moral authority. If you depend on moral authority, nothing will happen. The Pope says this and the Pope says that, and doubtless he's well-intentioned, but what good does it do? So utopian reasoning is counterproductive. We must not pretend that power doesn't matter, because power is always going to matter. It's the nature of power that power will matter. Evolution has washed fairness up on our social beach. It's designed for small scale applications. I think we see it all the time on the small scale. Whose turn is it to speak? Who gets that parking space? Who should move how much? When there's a narrow alleyway, that kind of thing. And we solve these problems so effortlessly, we don't even notice that they're coordination problems. But they are coordination problems, and they all have an infinite number of equilibria. How come we know which one? How come we know which one? So easily we know it, we don't even think it's a problem. Fairness norms are egalitarian, not utilitarian. Rawls is right and Hassani is wrong in coordination problems. Hassani is right and Rawls is wrong about designing a tax system and such like. But that's not what we're talking about. And most importantly of all, people make their own welfare comparisons, not the comparisons we want them to make. So if we're trying to do good in the world and we want to persuade people, look, let's not do what we're doing. Let's use our sense of fairness to go from here to there. It's no use preaching to them from the pulpit and telling them the right way to make welfare comparisons is this. And I am the person who knows, because they know already how to make welfare comparisons. You might not like the welfare comparisons they make, but if you've got to persuade them, you might over time gradually persuade to change welfare comparisons if you're very good at it. But if you want something in the here and now, you have to take the welfare comparisons as they are. So I usually quote Aristotle on slaves here. Aristotle says that slaves are natural barbarians, and therefore it's perfectly all right to enslave them. Spinoza spends several pages on the natural inferiority of women. And in those days, it was completely pointless, trying to persuade Aristotle's world to abolish slavery. It's just a waste of time. But there are other things that they were understood perfectly about the eliminating tyrants from various cities and the like. So people make their own welfare comparisons, not the comparisons we want them to make. And let's move the world to places where we might conceivably be able to go. And here are my books again. And I'm probably overrun, I'm sorry. But, okay. Thank you.